I'm back again for another set of quilt blocks from the 2023 Sweater Weather Quilt Along. This includes my absolute favorite block so far and my very first foray into improv quilting. This video covers blocks 5, 6, and 7 of the Sweater Weather Quilt Along. Let's dive right in with Harvest Moon, which is block 5. This is block 5. It's Harvest Moon by Remi Vale Studio. And as you can see, it's one really big curve as the focal point. After tackling curves on the second block, which was Falling Leaves, I was pretty confident that I was going to be able to tackle this curve, and it turned out to be a cinch. I cut my fabric for all 3 blocks at once, and then I started pinning. I had a lot of reference to do with the patterns. I hate wasting fabric, so I thought that cutting everything at once would save me on fabric. It did, but because each designer set up their patterns differently, I had to go back and forth between PDFs over and over again throughout the process. When I printed my template for Harvest Moon, I could tell that my gauge square was just a teeny tiny bit off. I lined my ruler up on top of it, and you could just see the edges of the printed square that were just a little bit on the inside of my ruler block. Instead of playing with my printer settings, which is an objectively difficult and terrible task even for somebody who works in IT, I actually was kind of smart and decided that I was just going to leave a bunch of extra along the outside of the template. The pattern called for you to square up the curved unit anyway, so I was going to need to cut it anyway, so I just left myself a little bit extra, and it was a good thing that I did because I think I probably would have been about 1/4 of an inch off. It worked out great. My squared up curve unit looked awesome. So next it was as simple as sewing a few long strips together and adding the border, which is snowballed with orange like all of the other blocks in this quilt along. This block is very effective. It definitely looks like a moon over a field to me, maybe a sun over a field to me. I considered making the moon in the silver or gray fabric that I have through the rest of the quilt, but I thought that the red would add a nice cohesiveness to the entirety of the quilt, and I didn't want to throw that off. Thinking about this a little bit more, I bet you could do like a binary sun situation and make a Star Wars block similar to this. It's not a bad idea, actually. I might have to play around with that in a little bit. Block 6 is Aspen Grove by Carnelian Quilting, and this is hands down my favorite block in this quilt so far. Honestly, I think it's the best written block too. The aspen trees are created with improv quilting, which I have never done before, and the stripes behind the aspen trees are made with a strip set. I'd strip pieced my very first block in this quilt, seeing plaid, but I struggled because I didn't leave myself any wiggle room or extra fabric. This pattern smartly called for a bit of overage in the strip set in order to make up for the wonkiness that inevitably happens when sewing such long lines. I tried to combat this by sewing in opposite directions, so I'd sew the green one direction, and then I'd sew the next blocks together this way, then this way, etc. But I still wound up with some wonkiness, so I was glad to have that extra wiggle room and the ability to do some trimming at the end. The improv quilting was really cool, but was way outside of my norm. Even though I've been sewing since I was a little kid and quilting for 3 years, I rarely stray outside of my comfort zone because I really hate fixing sewing mistakes. I find it way more challenging than knitting. For this block, you build up the trees as a single unit and then cut them, rearrange them, and do a bit more cutting to give them some variety. I loved this technique and think it gave me some really beautiful trees. Even if I wound up with my trees a little bit short, I had to add some extra fabric to get more variety. It's improv, right? It doesn't really matter if you have to fix something because it's just you who knows it. Let me know if you've done any improv quilting and how you incorporate it into quilts that you make. Definitely, like I said, outside of my norm, so I love hearing and seeing what other people are improving. Block 7 of this quilt is Warm Woodlands by Crafty Moose Quilts. This quilt block is super similar to a traditional maple leaf quilt block or a bear claw quilt block, and I hate to say it, but this has been my least favorite block so far. It's the least original of the blocks, and I really disliked the cutting instructions. You wind up cutting for half square triangles made both 1 at a time and 2 at a time, which means that you wind up with weird scraps and having to cut several different sizes of squares and rectangles from a single strip. I expected this to be super quick to finish, but it took me almost as long as my Harvest Moon block. It does fit nicely into the rest of the quilt. I just probably wouldn't choose to make it again, at least not at this scale. It just wasn't my favorite, and maybe that's because I was finishing quilting this at the very end of a very long night of quilting. I am loving this quilt along, and there's only 2 blocks left, which is kind of crazy. I've done a decent job of keeping up, so the next clue comes out this Friday. Once again, I've included a link to the quilt along in the description. The blocks are only going to be available until November 3rd, so if there's something that struck your fancy, make sure that you take a look at that quilt along and download the existing blocks. I'll be back in a few weeks with my very last sweater weather piecing update, although I'm sure I'll have an update on the quilting at a later time. So make sure that you come on back and take a look if you're interested. The next 2 are much more complicated and work on a much smaller scale, including piecing small curves as opposed to one really big curve. So I'm really excited to finish this up. Happy crafting, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and seeing what I have cooked up for next time. Bye.